Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Margot Norton. I'm the Chief Curator here at Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and I'm just so thrilled to be here with you all for today's panel conversation on painting and technology with Jamillah James, Barbara Kasten, and Gloria Sutton, three incredibly brilliant women, and I'm just so excited to hear from them. Thank you so much for joining us. So our conversation today is in conjunction with our exhibition, as I'm sure you all know, Making Their Mark, works from the Shah Garg Collection, which assembles 78 artworks by an international group of 68 women artists who've created truly groundbreaking works. This collection is just really remarkable, and it's just such an honor to be able to bring it here to Berkeley and to share it with our audiences. And so thrilled that we could actually start this series of panel conversations around the thematic threads of the exhibition. It was really also just such a joy to get to work together with collector Kamal Shah and Cecilia Alamani, who's a wonderful curator on this presentation here in Berkeley. One thing that you'll notice about the show is that we organized the show into thematic sections to kind of further hone in and expand upon the thematic threads of the show as it was in New York last year, and to provide it the art historical context, for our audiences at the museum, and to allow these dialogues between works to emerge. There's also a huge emphasis on these intergenerational dialogues in the show, often pairing the work of emerging artists with the path-breaking contributions of their predecessors, many of who have been unjustly marginalized in the past, and to bring those works together to really show how pivotal these works have been for so many artists, and how they will continue to inspire so many artists for many years to come. This panel discussion is part of a series of panels that we're doing in conjunction with these themes in the show. So we had one back in November with artists Arya Dean and Mary Weatherford that was moderated by Katie Siegel on gestural abstraction in painting. And please save the date for our future conversations. We have one coming up on March 15th on the topic of crafting the self, which is moderated by amazing curator and writer Janelle Porter with artists Melissa Cody and Tao Lewis. And then on April 17th, we'll conclude the series with a panel discussion on disobedient bodies, including artists in the show such as Suzanne Jackson, which is moderated by a amazing professor here at UC Berkeley and writer Hilton Alls. Barbara Kasten's incredible artwork, Photogenic Painting, which is on view in our exhibition, is one of the really pivotal works in the show. It was created in 1974, and it opened up so many possibilities for new ways of thinking about vision and experimental approaches to media. The work is actually a photogram created through an alchemical cameraless process, which I look forward to hearing more about in her presentation today. Photogenic painting set the stage for the innovative works that Kasten would continue to produce, which have truly transformed not only how we see, but how we think about what it means to see. Like Barbara, many artists in the exhibition have innovated approaches to painting with the evolution of technologies, as art historian Gloria Sutton has beautifully articulated in her essay for the exhibition catalog for Making Their Mark, which is titled The Computational Logic of Contemporary Painting. And I so look forward to hearing more from Gloria today in a kind of deep dive into several artists in the exhibition who are featured prominently in the show, including Laura Owens, Sarah Z, and Haegu Young, who've made use of digital tools to adapt their physical mark-making processes. And curator Jamillah James, who moderates today's conversation, has also deeply researched this area for many, many years, resulting in her incredible exhibition, which is now on view at the MCA in Chicago, titled The Living End: Painting and Other Technologies from 1970 to 2020. Her exhibition surveys how artists have continually pushed the medium of painting forward and the impact that computers, cameras, television, as well as social media and automation have had on the medium for the past 50 years. So I'm honored to introduce today's distinguished guests before an introduction by Jamillah, followed by presentations by Gloria and Barbara, followed by a conversation between the three of them, leaving room for questions in the end. So please take note of any questions that come up in the conversation and save them for the end of the discussion. Barbara Kasten is a visual artist based in Chicago. After initially studying painting, Kasten studied textiles with fellow Making Their Mark artist Trude Germont-Prey at the California College of Arts and Crafts in Oakland. Since the early 1970s, Kasten has explored the potentials and technologies of the photographic medium across her practice, from the photogenic painting series featured in our exhibition to later experiments that reveal the technological dimensions of painting and photography. We're also very honored to have recently acquired a suite of photographs from Kasten's figure chair series for our collection, which she will present on as well. Yep. Gloria Sutton is an associate professor of contemporary art history and new media at Northeastern University in Boston. Her scholarship analyzes the ways durational media have shaped the reception of visual art since the 1960s. She received her doctorate from the University of California, Los Angeles, and has been a fellow at the Getty Research Institute. She is a contributor to the Making Their Mark catalog, as I mentioned, and author of The Experience Machine, Stan Vanderbeek's Moviedrome and Expanded Cinema, and the editor of the first volume on the photographic and sculptural work of Sarah Vanderbeek. Sutton is finalizing the manuscript for her latest monograph, Pattern Recognition, Contemporary Art in the Age of AI. Jamillah James is Manilow Senior Curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. Previously, she was Senior Curator at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles, and co-curator with me, one of the greatest collaborations of my life, of Softwater Hard Stone, the 2021 New Museum Triennial in New York. She's held curatorial positions at the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles, the Studio Museum in Harlem, New York, the Queens Museum, and independently curated numerous exhibitions and programs at alternative and artist-run spaces throughout the US and Canada. She's contributed to Artform Freeze, Art in America, the International Review of African American Art, and numerous institutional exhibition catalogs. She's also the editor of the new reprint edition of Charles Gaines and Catherine Lord's Theater of Refusal, Black Art and Mainstream Criticism. Her exhibition, The Living and Painting and Other Technologies, is on view at the MCA Chicago through March 16th. So please join me in welcoming Jamillah James, followed by Gloria Sutton and Barbara Kasten, and a conversation with the three. Thank you so much. Welcome, Jamillah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Margot and Julian Kamal, for inviting me to moderate today's discussion, which is quite timely considering the attention around the themes of art and technology seen in several recent exhibitions, including my own, the current exhibition on view at BAMFA, and also exhibitions at Mudam Luxembourg, the show Radical Software, Women, Art, and Technology, Tate Modern, their show Electric Dreams, Art and Technology Before the Internet, and LACMA's Coded, Art Enters the Computer Age, 1952 to 1982. I'm beyond thrilled to be joined today by Gloria Sutton and Barbara Kasten to delve into their contributions to Making Their Mark. First, I wanted to take the opportunity to discuss overlapping moments within this exhibition and part of the reason why I've been invited here today. There are several examples of new painting and Making Their Mark, highlighting the ways in which artists have approached the time-worn and honored practice of painting and painterliness after 1960, and particularly in the last 20 years. Further, the intersections with the ever-nebulous term of technology emerge in Making Their Mark, both through the artistic embrace of photography, computing, and the internet, like in the work of Haegu Yang, Sarah Z, and Laura Owens, which you'll hear more about from Gloria shortly. Also included in Making Their Mark is work by Howardina Pindell, whose hole punch paintings combine conceptualist systems and repetition with collage and painting. And then there's also more tactile technologies such as weaving and other handicrafts, like in the work of Rosemary Trockle and her knitted pictures, the work of Faith Ringgold and Joyce Scott, among others. And lastly, there's the work of Barbara Kasten, who we'll hear from also later, who fused photographic practices with a painter's approach. Considering technology was originally defined as skill, craft, and technique, it is just as slippery a term as painting as action and object is today. I wanted to talk a little bit about my exhibition, The Living End, which considers the different imaging technologies such as computing, the internet, photography, and video, and how they've influenced painting and the trajectory toward new painting starting in the mid-1960s, like Studies in Perception 1, which is seen at the right of this slide, by Leon Harmon and Ken Knowlton, which is one of the first computer-generated and transmitted images. The image also includes many works that are adjacent to painting, such as this example by the LA-based artist Barbara T. Smith, which is one of her many experimentations with the Xerox copier at a point in time when Xerox copiers were not widely available. The exhibition also considers the televisual and the early emergence of screens, as seen here by the work of Stan Vanderbeek and Roy Colmer. And also this example by Howardina Pindell from her video drawing series, which involved Pindell's drawings on a television screen in a manner similar to her paintings. Like Pindell, Judy Chicago also appears in both exhibitions and is represented in The Living End by her smoke performances of the late 1960s and early 1970s, which gave new meaning to landscape painting. The Living End also includes a number of practitioners who have adopted digital means of production, like Avery Singer, whose studio visit painting uses software like SketchUp as a form of computer-assisted drawing. Sarah Z and Laura Owens likewise incorporate the gestures and glut of information from the digital world in their complex works. Sarah Z's after-image Rainbow Disturbance, which is in the MCA's collection, composites different layers of information, both conceptual and physical, to approximate the whirlwind of experience in an artist's studio and online. Whereas Laura Owens and also Jacqueline Humphreys use the internet and its particularized language as material. Humphrey's technique of using stencils filled with ASCII, short for the American Standard Code of Information Interface, which I always get wrong, but I'm glad I got it right today. She uses ASCII characters to press and accumulate oil paint on the surface of her paintings, later physically manipulating the surface, recalling both silk screening and earlier printing technology and Photoshop editing, while forming its own idiosyncratic system of image production. Lastly, there are artists like Petra Courtwright, Wade Guyton, and Sebren Versteeg, who are all pictured here, who suggest that painting in the 21st century is by extension a mechanical process, and they outsource the physical production of their paintings to algorithms, painting software, and printers, complicating the notion of the art object singularity, as well as the original versus copy paradigm. The exhibition ends with examples of the further reaches of painting and its tropes when it's fully subsumed by the digital, as is the case of Cory Archangel's Super Mario Clouds and the sculptural paintings of Tishon Su. Both making their mark and The Living End are suggesting new modalities in painting that have become more legible as manifestations of history and methodologies collide and collapse into new and exciting ways. To hear more about how the artists in making their mark are doing so, I will now turn the stage over to Gloria. Thank you.
And I'm just going to say, you know, it's really a thrill to be here with an audience and collaborators like this in the room. And just to save time, I'm just going to say this sign, like, you know, thank you, thank you, thank you. So I really want to use my short introduction time to concentrate our attention on three incredible artists, as we've said, Sarah Z, Haegu Yang, and Laura Owens, and how they reveal the ways computational media, like painting itself, is not a stable phenomena, but rather a material process informed by the cultural conditions under which those media are made and circulated. So really, what do I mean by that, right? At its most basic level, the aesthetic operations of all technical media, from acrylic paint to electronic pixels, is to transmit differentiated information. This can include formal elements such as hue, saturation, line quality, as well as conceptual processes like variability or patterning that happen in both hand-painted works and computer-rendered images alike. And in these three brilliant compositions on view here from these artists, in the exhibition that you've all gotten to see, so I'll have to give my apologies for the slides, but this is a very rare occasion when you'll actually get to go see the works, or you've already seen them. These artists make tacit the way an artwork does not just represent, but it renders a worldview structured by the graphical systems we use every day, such as scrolling, zooming in, quietly underscoring how images are treated as objects to be optimized for compatibility across digital platforms. Since the late 1990s, when these three artists came to public attention, scale, the physical, palpable, commensurable relationship between an image and its contextual frame, or what we would call a matrix, has really rarely been noted in art criticism and often rendered irrelevant. In the era of open-ended variation, scale is often broadly treated as just simply a formatting issue. And instead, one of the reasons I look at these three artists together, Hegu and Sarah and Laura, is because they have asked us to consider exponentially larger quantities of data and a broader range of inputs. They expand and compress how we picture ourselves in a world that I would argue has continued to shift away from modernist universal or industrial standards of universality toward the decidedly contingent sense of alterity that shapes subjectivity in our current world, which I think you heard Jamillah speak very poignantly about today. Over the past 2 decades, a period marked by the rise of what we call ubiquitous computing, which tethered life to an operating system rather than a device, these three artists have eschewed televisual formats, again, this notion of seriality, recording, and playback, instead choosing to draw on the computational operations of iteration, aggregation, as well as, I would argue, search functionality, marking digital images technology's complete integration into culture as simply ordinary, while also pointing to the complex and I would say deeply problematic ways that it has had on the way that we picture and relate to one another. Interfacing with the more fragmented and particularized audiences shaped by the rise of the internet, a concern that our dear colleague here, Eva Raspini, has prodigiously mined in her path-breaking exhibition from 2018, Art in the Age of the Internet, and as well as you saw Jamillah making that conceptual argument out here. A close reading of Sarah and Laura and Hegu's works help us comprehend the wide-scale purchase digital computing has had on all forms of contemporary art. So this is the argument here, right? They tell us more about the digital age than actually born digital content does. So here I'm going to talk and frame about their works in what we call digital affordances, and specifically the three you see of iteration, aggregation, as well as the concept of search functionality. So looking at Sarah's crisscross, which you get to see phenomenally in the exhibition across the hall, an image is composed of a set of smaller images cut through with incised and painted lines. And seeing it in person, and also the work that Jamillah showed us in the slides, should disabuse any viewer that the idea that digital code is limited to a screen or the projected image. Created with the specific parameters of its public presentation in mind, the architecturally scaled work makes clear that code controls the physical world through the built environment. Specifically in Crisscross, iteration operates as recursive motifs, hands manipulating materials, birds in states of flight, flames in various degrees of combustion, and cloud formations that appear in intersecting tracks across the almost 12-foot spans of the work. The work also pushes us to think about iteration over seriality, one of the pair of canvases in what Sarah calls its original state, and the other, quote, a step away from that state. Crisscross was initially mounted so that the viewer was caught between these two images, that one had to toggle between the two works in order to rectify these images, in her words. And she describes the experience as part of a longer investigation into the very process of iteration itself, in this quote here from Sarah. So I would argue that iteration, which is endemic to computational software, pushes against the deeply ingrained modernist trope of original versus copy, in which the hierarchy of value continues to elevate notions of singularity and uniqueness. And this is one of the key issues, I think, in Jamillah's exhibition as well. Moreover, the computation scalar terms, expansion and compression, have come to supplant modern art historical framing devices, from abstraction to minimalism, that either delete or proliferate aesthetic material for the aggregation of data, particularly around issues of resolution and fidelity. And this is something that Haegu Yang, who is explicitly probed in a range of materials evocative of industrial fabrication, craft, and performance. Her signature vulnerable arrangements and what she calls dress vehicles use found furniture, electric fans, wheels, and Venetian blinds, among other materials, to mobilize structures that engage in acts of folding and unfolding, while also examining themes of doubling and halving as forms of aggregation. In an early example, Yang's thinking about aggregation is foregrounded in the 2010 Trustworthy Works. Here's one of the dress pieces that I was talking about earlier, to give another example. So this is the piece that's on view here, in which she generates tessellated collages from cutting the security liners of mailing envelopes. This is the sort of junk mail or mail that you get procured from galleries or museums, and her own personal snail mail, and arranging them in a gradient pattern that moves from the frame to the wall and back again. She transforms simple business envelopes, analog vehicles essentially for corporate dissemination of private information, inside out, deploying idiosyncratic tactics of aggregation and disaggregation. And moreover, she incorporates references to digital age security, such as encryption and passwords, and explores how they meet up with the more intimate notions of secrecy and privacy. And in this 2016 mural of Trustworthy, Masked Eyes, number 277, she foregrounds how the systems thinking of the 1960s have now given way to what we would think of as the 21st century time of networks, and that which is another sense of scale, like I said, of a kind of scalar expansion of thinking about questions, everything from spatializing seemingly invisible interactions from the dispersal of global capital to identity theft. I know I'm going quite quickly, and we're going to get to be able to unpack some of these a little further, so I just want sort of laying these visual materials and visual evidence out for us for consideration. And then switching finally to search functionality in the work of Laura Owens, who handily dispenses with digital culture's propensity for naturalizing the arbitrariness of images, in which images, from paintings to selfies alike, seem equally at home on the screen, be it a monitor or a smartphone, as they do installed in a museum or other physical space. So just to be clear, this work is a critique of this kind of idea that images are arbitrary or variable in that way. These seemingly dual characteristics, arbitrariness and algorithmic predetermination, in much of contemporary European American painting, have led critics to use the moniker Painting 2.0 to define painting after conceptualism as primarily concerned with issues of de-skilling and anti-authorship. However, I'm going to show another picture from 16. However, Owens' distinct painterly language is defined by period specificity and a commitment to rigorous experimentation with installation and drawing historical and social connections between patterns of information, and that can be algorithmic or handmade, art historical, or familial. And she also does this by pointing to their respective modes of dissemination, right? Websites, computer networks, books, prints, workshops, exhibitions, and communities of people. And in doing so, she's exposing those connections as ultimately material and eminently communal. In fact, her 2015 limited edition hand-formed porcelain emoji sculptures, about the size of a golf ball, convey the efficient expressiveness of literal digital icons through an economic application of colored glazes and spare indentations. Laura's emoji sculptures reverted back into computer graphical imagery when they were circulated as a series of Apple iMessage stickers downloadable from the App Store. Unfortunately, no longer available, but we're relying on these sort of pixelated screen grabs to reflect the sheen of the porcelain surface and the flat gray ovals used to render her drop shadows that she often uses in her own canvases. The recursive relationship between digital forms and analog objects is further examined by Laura in the painting here, and I'm going to show just a quick detail. In this towering canvas, undulating bands of cross-stitch X's blur into recursive pixelated lines. And so for me, it refers up to everything from bitmapped video games to homespun embroidery, demonstrating reliance on both craft and computation, the fact that both craft and computation rely on grids, arrays, and codes. In fact, to create the work, Owens scanned swatches of found embroidery, such as samplers, in use since the 1400s as a tool to teach young women the alphabet and other practical and ideological matters, and placed them alongside her signature drop shadows. Not simply painterly trompe-l'oeil, Owens's techniques make a material argument about the weight and forbearance of history, how it is taught and passed down through mechanisms of aggregation and iteration. And in Untitled from 2016, the artist interrupts this lesson with an actual spinnable bicycle wheel adorned with hand-painted hearts, which evokes both the Duchampian ready-made and a bored student doodling. The work is a tour de force of her insistence on referencing both the context and the formats of her subjects. Lens-based imagery remains flat on the surface. Textiles are built up through strands that iterate lengthwise and widthwise, the warp and weft of strings acting as a set of arrays and of a kind of computational formula. Now, while much has been written about the ways Laura's work has gone, none of these artists, they're very much, like I said, in the public discourse around contemporary painting. But what's really striking to me is no one's really remarked upon the way that, as we see in this painting, that she is steadily and no less powerfully shown that what we can call the epistemology of search, that meaning can be derived by revealing not only the end result, like how you find the photos or find the reference or find the sampler, but the process in which that leads up to that kind of discovery. Now, this is where I'm just going to throw out a couple of argumentative points that we can kind of, pull apart later. But honestly, I would say, like I said, Laura doesn't get credit for that kind of idea of epistemology of search, and that the process of search, the process of looking and how we find it, is part of the work itself. But that's an inquiry that many of my dear colleagues in art history, especially David Joslet, have primarily attributed to Owens's male peers, most notably Seth Price, who in particular his 2002 treatise Dispersion is often cited as a way of explicating how an artwork exists as a variable format, right? That its meaning takes the form of a version that can be, a file output as an individual print or a standalone or PDF. And yet Owens makes it evident in this work, and I would arguably say, after we hear from Barbara as well, that code is not limited to the digital, but informs the photographic, the printed, and the woven. And because code is not a thing in and of itself, the question is not what painting under computation cannot do or can do, but the one that Laura poses in her own essay published in Price's 2018 catalog, that she argues, right, that the point is not to foreground, quote, recent technological developments in photography and printing, but rather to critically ask, quote, what can you do with it? And so I want to end by ultimately saying that the inherently digital conditions outlined in these three works help us apprehend the ways that iteration, aggregation, and search functionality are not simply visual metaphors, right, but they're instantiations of the ways that all media operate under the pressure of computation. Not only making this visible, but recognizable as a cultural construction. And I would say that's a point that remains critically pressing in the long digital age. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you to everybody for inviting me, to Julie, who I know from Chicago days, to Margot, who is a new friend, and to my two new friends here. Of course, Jamillah I know from Chicago, but this is a new one for me here with you, right? So anyhow, it's wonderful to be here, but it's also a place that I love to come back to. And I lived in this area twice in my lifetime. First, right out of undergrad school at the University of Arizona when you get out of school and you have to see the world, the call was from San Francisco. So I came here with friends and lived, a very interesting time. I had a job in fashion doing displays in a woman's specialty shop on Geary Avenue. I lived under Coit Tower and, pretended to be a beatnik and had my black stockings and coffee at the beatnik store or cafes. So, I had this notion that I was going to be an artist, but, I was kind of messing around with it. I wasn't as really committed as I might have, as I came to be later. But when I was at the University of Arizona, I did study painting. It's kind of like what everybody, a young art student, needs to know, especially at that time. You had to study painting. There were crafts, but painting was it. That was the serious technique to follow, or the serious ideas that you wanted to express. So I had that background, and when I decided to, after 2 years of being here and having fun, I wanted to see Europe. So I went to Europe and stayed in Germany for several years. And during that time, I saw a lot of interesting exhibitions. And one trend that I saw happening that really appealed to me was the textiles that were kind of, the textile tradition was tapestry, but there were people who were beginning to use it in a more unusual way, like Magdalena Bakanovich, and taking it out of that, more traditional place on the wall, making it sculptural, using a lot of unusual materials like sisal and things you wouldn't expect in a textile. And to be honest with you, I had been painting, and I did apply for a grad school back in the States, and I didn't get in. So it was like, okay, now what? Should I pursue this more, or what should I do? And when I saw these exhibitions, I connected with it because the texture, the color, the forms, the experimental aspect of it really appealed to me. And so that's how I actually decided to apply to grad school in fiber art. But one problem was I didn't know how to weave. So I had to apprentice myself to a weaver who had been trained at, where was she? Rhode Island School of Design. So she was in Arizona. When I came back, I learned to weave. I sent my work off, and I was accepted. And I got to work with, excuse me, I'll calm down in a minute. I got to work with Trude Guermonprez, who was a fantastic person, also a very talented one who had studied, I think she was studied with Gunther Stoltz, is that how you say her name? And actually came to the States to replace, names are coming to me, Annie Albers at the Black Mountain School. And she then was invited to open this program at CCAC. So I knew about her, and I got into the program. And the first slide that I'm going to show you is, how do I do that? Okay, here. There. Okay, so this was one of the, I don't have a lot of slides left from the early work, and in fiber textiles, we were working in large scale, kind of replicating the ideas that were being examined by mostly European people. And this was when I married photography with a textile form. I wasn't interested in the utilitarian side of fiber. I wanted, immediately I was pushing and pulling and making things into 3-dimension. And this came about when I discovered photography by taking one class and I photo silk screened it on the fabric, and I manipulated the fabric into the form. So it's a relief. I don't know where it is today, but that's where I started. But I realized that it actually was an indicator of everything that I was going to be working with for 40 or 50 years since then. It had the textile grid, which was something that seemed to be repeated in many of the things I've done. I'm trying to put together the slides of how this is kind of, the grid has become universal in the kinds of works that I've done. Not everything, but there's a trend there. And the photographic aspect of laying paint on a surface and more as a painterly gesture than any kind of a pragmatic one. So this is, and the form I use forms over and over. It doesn't seem that I have to continually make new kinds of images. I like using things so far and into depth with that I examine it on many different levels with many different techniques. So here's the same photographic silk screen. It was a silk screen on the other piece. And so it was then I used it in this kind of a paper, and then I made a banner. This is about maybe 7 feet long, and stuffed the forms. So everything kind of found a new life in a different way and with different materials, because materials are really my inspiration. And these kind of figurative abstractions, I think, continued when I went to Poland, which after I got my degree with CCAC, I had a Fulbright to go to work with Magdalena Bakanowicz, and luckily she didn't want me in her studio laboring over her work. She sent me off to do my own thing, which I did, and I made these forms. And you can see already I was into the form, into the female form. It was abstracted, and so I had to use a typical tapestry loom when I was in Poland. I was on this Fulbright for 9 months, and in an art school environment where I had a big studio and a huge tapestry loom. So I made these, and I kind of I made the design based on some really dressmaking techniques of leaving spaces to shape and form a dress, or manipulate a flat piece of fabric into form. And that's what I did with these. But I also incorporated them into the chairs. But this show, which was at California College of Arts and Crafts, I didn't want to, there's a couple examples of what they were at the time. Whoops, wait, I missed one. There's one. Okay. Then it was kind of my first installation, in the sense that I wasn't satisfied with just showing the sculptural forms. I wanted to have another commentary on it, and so the photographic aspect, I started making these diazotypes, and they're very fragile, and it was really a technique used by architects for proofing. So, this is probably one of the only many times I didn't use the camera a lot before actually Polaroids in the 80s. So this was the use of a model who happened to be a dancer and could help me show another version of the female form and how it could be manipulated. It could be kind of unusual in the sense that it wasn't realistic. And the grid, again, appeared here in these pieces, which weren't large. They were like 11 by 14 pieces of diazo paper. And then I used the same imagery because it was a process that at that time, it wasn't digital, of course, and so you had to go through a photographic process of making an internegative and then making the image on a piece of graphic arts film, and I had to use that in a contact process. So, and then I used the gridded material that, I found netting and things that had this grid in it. So, and I sprayed paint through it. So it was, again, a manipulation of materials that I was interested in. This is the material. And I began making these forms because when I came back from Europe, I did some adjunct teaching in design, textile design, and I needed to find a material in which I could demonstrate some of the techniques that I personally used. And I found this industrial fiberglass screening. It's the stuff that keeps the mosquitoes out of our windows. And I like the idea of using kind of materials and changing and repurposing them for an art project, looking at them with a new way. And when I found this material, I also discovered how the light really interacts with it, and the shadows became important. So the lighting became another central focus of everything I did. And the material itself had properties that could be melted and put together and three-dimensionalized. And of course, I was looking at I was in LA, and I was looking at Robert Irwin, and I was looking at all the light people, and I was inspired by their use of light and their ways of using unusual transparent materials. So this became another feature, and actually to this day I still use this material. I bought a huge roll, and I think I still have some. And this is another example of that other netting materials plus that screen, but my use of cyanotype, came from this need to have a hands-on in the production of an image and not produce it through a printing machine. I wanted to feel like I was actually creating the emulsion, and I was, because cyanotype is an old process that you paint on any surface that actually will absorb it. And I also discovered the photogram simultaneously. So this is a photogram on a cyanotype, one of the first things. And then, again, I continued the spray painting on top of that. So layers and layers of information. This is another cyanotype that isn't blue, which was kind of a unique a discovery along the way, and but the material that is so industrial and so ugly when you see it on your windows really became something ephemeral and beautiful, and that's so I worked with this material for quite a while, developing different colors, different ways of expressing it, mostly through this kind of a pulling, a stretching, something that I didn't like look for an image. I didn't look to make an image that might look like water or any representational kind of idea. It was really more from the position of abstraction with a material and expanding as far as I could those properties of that screening material. This is another one. And these were like 30 by 40 inches, so not the same size as the piece that's in the show. And as I went along, I started adding inks and color and, again, a painting technique. Because it was, I was looking at Frankenthaler. I was looking at people who did a lot of stain paintings, and that's what was happening in the 60s and 70s. So I was doing this, though, not to examine the properties of the photograph. I really wanted it to be an introduction to a new way of painting, into a way of discovering a new technique or not necessarily new, but a more personal relationship to the painting by using something that was not normally used. I'm always trying to change things, and this was one of the things that motivated me along these lines. This is another one from that same series. I worked on these for a couple of years, actually. I don't do a series and give up. I usually do something and continue to use it either in an intense way or move it on to another way of incorporating it. So, and here's another version. All with this, just simply the emulsion on the paper, the screen, and sometimes my own mark making on the screen so that it too became an image. So it was on the screen that was used as the photogram. It wasn't on the paper. It was actually part of the layering. These then, after that, I'm trying to show you this trend of how this beginning image I showed you kind of followed me through the years. And then in the following the more photographic aspect of what I was doing, I started to do these photograms on a much larger scale, like a photo mural paper, and it had to be done in the darkroom, and it did need chemistry, but because I manipulated it in a way that, didn't need perfect handling. I mean, traditional photography at that time was still black and white and very precise. It was the Ansel Adams ideology of making a beautiful tonality. And I kind of wanted to smash the whole idea and do something different. So that's how these came about. And the objects that seem to be kind of rotating in space are really just boxes, something geometric that would cast a shadow. And because it's a negative image, it starts looking much more ephemeral and light. These are, I painted them, I stretched them and adhered the paper to canvas, and they became really physically more like a painting with oil paint on top. And oil paint was my medium. I never have used any kind of acrylic, but that was my age because that's what we did back in those days. Acrylic, I don't think was I don't even know when it came to be, but it wasn't in my lexicon. And then some of these screens I put together in three-dimensional screen-like forms. And this is another material I found that was actually pre-sensitized with emulsion and became sensitive to light. So again, the screen then with a more geometric kind of line drawing on top. But that material wasn't available for that long. Now, let me see, did I actually, okay. So this now is 1922, and the same ideas, the same kind of interest in, expanding using unusual materials and expanding my thinking about painting. Still, this is on canvas, but it's on a special pre-sensitized canvas that I could print on. So I did get into digital printing, but I don't normally use any kind of digital processes. And although I did have the opportunity in the 80s when Apple was introducing the Adobe Photoshop program, they solicited many designers, artists, people from different design fields and artists, and gathered us together and taught us Photoshop. It just wasn't my thing to be concentrating on a screen. I had to have my hands on it. So for me, it didn't work. They did give me a computer, which was this big. I did use it to make some, what did I do? I used it to use components to make a large wall mural. So the printing came through that process. But I never got into using it as a medium or a way of expanding my my techniques, or it just didn't appeal to me. So I never got into that. This is another one along that line. With these works, I have also usually made an installation. For instance, these two pieces was in the gallery in Chicago, and I actually used some of the actual big pieces of grid, which were huge sheets of graded material that they used to pour concrete. I kind of look around in hardware stores and metal shops and any place where I think I can find something that would be more, that I could turn into another kind of object, I guess, more or less. And so I used the whole room was, the walls were covered in very casual leanings and distortions, and these were in the midst of the wall. So I'm not thinking totally as just a single object. All right, I'm almost here. Okay, so this is, again, some more recent work. And what you're looking at, which is kind of hard to explain because there's many layers, and unfortunately, the people who took this photograph didn't light it so that the shadow showed, because the shadow is actually a very important element in this work. But it's a cyanotype on cloth, and it's done when the cloth is stretched on canvas. Not a cyanotype and then pinned around a stretcher bar, but it actually was all saturated and put into the sunlight and washed and had much more painterly effects and feeling to it. And then the grid was made afterwards with a different kind of plan. And it took several, two or three sessions with working with people like the metal person, because I attached these in a way that they entered into the space, and then the light that was focused on it would create shadow around it, so it doesn't look as clean on the edges as it does here. And these are not very big. They're like 24 by 24. And then this is the use of the emulsion alone. There's nothing in here except, on this paper, except emulsion. That's the cyanotype emulsion. And those were in the 90s when I did that. So I continued this photogram, which I, discovered because being interested in Truda and the Bauhaus, of course, and photography, Moholy-Nagy and came to mind, and he and his wife Lucia, worked on these photograms. Of course, she never gets any credit, but that's what really, she taught him how to do it. And these are the last two I'll show you, which is the works I'm doing now for a show at the Glass House, Philip Johnson's Glass House estate. And I show them to you because these are about 3 or 4 layers of this emulsion. Normally in a photographic cyanotype photogram, you put something down, you expose it, and that's it. But I did it in a slower way so that I could build it, and I could see it as a painter would. After one layer, I could decide I needed something to balance it out in a different way. I needed a different tone, and I've gotten to the point where I can control that. And I was also happy because I didn't need the hot sunlight. I could do it in Chicago, in my backyard, very primitive, and do it in a much slower, more controlled way. So that whole idea of painting, I think, still resonates in this because it's a painterly approach to what I'm doing, not a really photographic approach. So that's what I have to show you, and I hope I didn't take up too much time. That way? Oh, I'm going to sit. Okay.
So we're running a little over, but we can stay till 3:30. So we'll have a few minutes for discussion and hope for a few questions from the audience as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Oops. Hello. All right. Great. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Gloria, for your presentations. I'm going to keep our questions pretty straightforward and open it to both of you as opposed to one or the other. Barbara, your use of the photogram and cyanotype, which has been a cornerstone of your work, and also early cameraless techniques, which are being more and more embraced by artists working today, was a very deliberate choice when already there were a number of ways of making images that were available to you. Embracing more analog approaches, like those also seen throughout the exhibition, seems to be a slightly radical gesture still when there's so many digital means of making work. So a question for both of you. Why do you think that there's a persistence of the tactile or analog as a primary direction for artists, even though there are so many alternatives?
Well, I personally think it's part of being an artist to have your hands into the artwork, and I don't approach it strictly from an intellectual or from a mental point of view, and I think it's the timing. I'm a lot older, and I haven't, don't see things in the same way younger people do, and I need to have time, I need to have contact, and so I think that people discover that too when they get. I noticed I taught for a while in Chicago, and it seemed like there was a lot more interest in people coming back to learn black and white photography, even though everybody was doing digital, and even so everything was on the computer. There were digital printers, but people wanted to have that hands-on experience.
And I might just add that, like, even in your, specifically in the slides that you showed in your exhibition, to remind everyone that, like, software wasn't necessarily faster or more efficient. In fact, for many artists, you know, it was cost prohibitive, right? And access to mainframe computing. You mentioned you were there with, you know, Adobe and Photoshop and thinking about the desktop, but, you know, often it was proprietary. You couldn't get access to these types of, so I just want to make sure and to remind ourselves that in this period of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Xerox PARC, the whole history of this particular area, artists were brought in to be the sort of beta testers, let's say, for a lot of this early work, so that there was this back and forth relationship. And so what we think of as efficient, or the toolbox that we think of with Photoshop, actually came from art tools, right? Like cropping, you know, blocking, blurring, all of those tools were photographic tools that then were, you know, sort of transposed into a kind of language of software. So I would arguably say that it's a different kind of dialectical relationship as well, right? That those things we're trying to model through software, what you intuitively or tacitly did with your hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also there are new vernaculars of painting which also respond to that. I mean, you spoke about painting 2.0 and how that really changed the ways in which painting would unfold after 2000. But I see that there is some kind of push and pull between those two things, and there's further distance between photography and painting, even though it seems that they are colliding both formally and conceptually. So I wanted to ask, what would you say the push and pull, would you say that the push and pull is a result of the digital or something else at play?
No, you.
I mean, there's you know, a lot of conditions are, I think part of it is the artists that we've put on display, or we talked about today, are intellectually, you know, interested in a kind of history of conceptual ideas of materials and debates and ideologies. So you know, we can't really remove it from that, number one. Number two, I would say the push and pull, it's not, you know, we talk about someone like Barbara's work and the ways in which she was misrecognized purposefully through much of her career as a photographer, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the let's say the idea that of, you know, they were still beholden to a kind of typology of media in which museums and collecting categories, funding agencies and grants, you know, still hold to that. And so someone like Barbara's work, which is inherently intellectual, inherently conceptual, and deeply material, was never going to be read or allowed to be read, versus someone like John Chamberlain or any of the other artists of this particular period. And I'm throwing him out because if we were going to organize people by material, some people were able to kind of play in the margins and others weren't, right? And that's one of the questions that still comes up.
And it seemed like for me personally, you know, I had the support of the photo community. They actually supported my experimentation within their own structures. The way they worked was not what I did, but they helped me in a lot of ways. I had the Guggenheim was based on the cyanotype, and you know, at a time when everybody else was doing that was in the 80s. So you know, it was a recognition within a smaller community, but not within the art world. And you know, in a lot of ways, look how long it took to even get photography accepted now, and it's not still, I don't think, looked at in the same way. You probably haven't thought about that.
I mean, but it's also, you know, it's a media that within our generation or lifetime, I teach undergraduates, there's lots of students here too, you know, this idea that, you know, when I would make this kind of gesture, what that meant or this meant is, you know, doesn't,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
right? So we're talking about a graphical interface that doesn't work in the same ways anymore. And photography, like many other mark making or tools or acts of rendering an image is, like I said, a composite of multiple technologies. It's not one type of technology, right? So it's both the act of looking, that we talked about this, the act of frame, of editing in frame, in camera versus what's output. So there's multiple steps. So I'll just quickly say, for me, it's about the curatorial imprintor of many of you sitting in the room tonight or to this afternoon to say that photography is both a linguistic trope, a language, a conceptual operation, just as much as computational media is. And I think as curatorial gestures have changed, that's important. For me, my dear colleagues in art history can't get over the medium, the typology of media. That's the holdup. Really. The artists have always been doing it. The curators are deeply meshed in it, and it's the art historians that are still trying to have these debates. How many panels have we went to about the death of photography? Or like the way that
the painting,
right? The way that
show.
your project is about, the living end of it, right? So I would just say it's really my dear colleagues in art history who've done the most damage. But that's why I find it, that's why for all the PhD students out there, there's plenty of opportunity. Come on down, we need you,
But it also, to me, it also ends up being about money because,
100%.
it's the funding that you get for departments. And therefore, you keep departmental separations because, you have to fight for every penny to teach. So that has something to do with it.
And every
too.
photographer or every artist that uses a photographic medium gets questioned on conservation and stability and things like that. And that's why I mentioned John Chamberlain. It's like nobody asked him about auto paint, right? Or car paint or whatever. So what I'm saying is that artists now have to contend with those kinds of questions around conservation and preservation that, artists didn't have to in the past, or Wade Guyton didn't have to in the past.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up instability because that was a question that I had in terms of how instability might show up in your work, Barbara. A number of the artists that we spoke about today all work in abstraction, which is in itself a form of instability of the image. So, Barbara, in what other ways do you think that instability shows up in your practice?
I haven't actually thought about it in those terms. I mean, abstraction has always been something that I've gravitated to because it involves geometry and color and form and all the techniques, I guess, that come to me that I can use and are based in those concepts. So when you say instability, I'm not quite sure what that means. Materially, yes, there's no stability to a lot of photographic processes. The cyanotype is much more stable than any others. But when you get to digital printing, it's not going to last. Polaroid is not going to last. Mm-hmm. And yet I did, lots of work at Polaroid, and they were very helpful in supporting artists and to do experimental work in photography.
Do you want to add anything?
I was just going to say that goes back to this idea that, we spend all of these resources to digitize collections right now, right? There's a big push on everything from books to, to artworks and things like that. But as we know, through compression and digital reproducibility, that lossy compression or information drops out. And it's both a technical, and that's the lesson from your work, Barbara, and throughout art history, is that it's both a technical apparatus that has conceptual and ideological meaning behind it, right? So that's why thinking about an image that's compressed versus abstract is one that loses information the more that it circulates, right? And it's being optimized for maximum compatibility across multiple commercial digital platforms, not because we want to have a deep formal connection to a work. Mm-hmm. And abstraction really is a reduction of information to pure color, form, lines, etc., not for the fact of erasure, but because, like what you showed us so beautifully in your slideshow, going from the form of the human body to the form of the line, that still is connected throughout. It's an embodied experience, it's an unfolding experience over time, and it's about aggregation and accretion that happens through what you said, multiple layers over and over again. And so I think that's one of the things to as a reminder that, that it still takes time, mm-hmm. right? And it's still deeply embodied with your hands and not just acts of looking. I think that's deeply important too.
Well, we could sit up here and talk for hours, but we do need to toss it out to the audience for Q&A. So if you have a question of either of these guests, please raise your hand and the mic will run to you. We have a person right here.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, fourth row back.
Yep.
It was a great presentation. I wanted to ask Barbara, you mentioned concrete, but I didn't see that you used it. Did you use it in your work?
Concrete, did I mention that?
I don't know.
Oh.
Oh, the rebar.
Oh, yeah, the material that's used in concrete. No, I haven't used concrete itself, no.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I am interested in architecture, and a lot of what I do, building materials are important to a lot of the imagery I make. And so they might be related to, but not usually, the sculpture I make is not usually any kind of a poured or like not bronze, it's not more traditional kinds of materials.
So for Barbara, your early images with the female form, do you still have access to those images? And are you ever drawn to using, if so, are you ever drawn to using them today in your imagery?
If there's a reason to, I would. I actually, those images that the museum just acquired were on a very fragile paper, and so I actually, but I had to make this inner negative I mentioned. So I still have the box of the original negatives and the internegatives, and we printed a book showing that, and then these portfolios, but because of the fragile nature of the originals. So, but the imagery themselves, I mean, you know, the day may come that I will, and I don't hesitate to do that if it fits what I'm thinking about. Oops, there's somebody here.
Oh, in the back.
Hi. Thanks for that. I was interested in how you talked about the relationship between artists and technology companies, especially in the early days, giving this utopian start with Xerox PARC, inviting artists as researchers and progress makers. And I'm curious how that relationships has changed over time and where it is today, given your particular research and experience with art and technology.
Yeah, I mean, we have, you know, examples of EAT and WGBH being some of the first residencies for artists and filmmakers. Oftentimes NASA, you know, Stan Vanderbeek had a residency at NASA. If you can imagine a filmmaker and an experimental artist from Black Mountain College being asked to be in residence at NASA. So, and, you know, and obviously with Xerox PARC and even with Polaroid, and a long history of that relationship, which does continue now. It's more through different types of sponsorship. And so remember, too, that a lot of this has to do with that's being, I think, also organized through institutions and universities. So remember, you know, one of the other things too is that it was, you know, they're corporate and technological, and it's all bankrolled oftentimes by the Department of Defense. So if we look at now with games and gaming, the biggest underwriter for, I think, research in that area is the U.S. Army, right, for simulation and gameplay and things like that. So there's a long history where we think technology is neutral, but we've shown through art history that it's not, that it's actually most of the sort of deeper art and technology sponsorships, whether from corporations or the military, were meant to ameliorate things like the development of the atomic bomb. So we have the Santa Fe Institute, MIT might, you know, where I work with the MIT LIST. Visual Arts Center was set up primarily as, again, a amelioratory way to kind of try to think about how art could, you know, mitigate the damage of the DoD, right? So that's really the backbone of it. But things like the Fulbright and other residency models, and it's really important to think about the viability of those in a moment right now where it's not just going to be the market and the university, but we need other modes to triangulate the ways that artists circulate in the world.
I think we have time for one more question before we close.
I'm interested in this idea that you talked about earlier about stability of an image or stability of an artwork. And I just would like you to talk more about it, because certainly in my own experience, when I was younger and going to museums and seeing early Picasso works with newspapers in them, and they were all yellow, the fact that they were yellow helped me understand how long ago they had been made. And for me, the history of the piece added to it, which had to do with some of it being unstable. And we can't keep things in its current time forever. So I'm just wondering if you have more thoughts about stability.
Yeah, I mean,
I'll quickly just say that, I mean, at least with Mark, I think the programming that's coming up too, thinking about stability both as a, in terms of, thinking about fragmentary, alterity, ideas of subjectivity is one of the topics that comes up in this exhibition, in this collection, and one of the themes that, Margot's curatorial acumen is showing us. Stability also comes into the idea that, yes, I totally agree with you that, ideas around ephemerality and things that are meant to be, like entropically, moving and shifting at all times, but I would be doing a disservice to my wonderful colleagues in conservation who I learned so much from. And in fact, that's really where I think a lot of this work is, those questions conceptually are being answered. Like, what does it mean to acquire a Martine Sims app at this point? What are you actually acquiring? How do you conserve that? And we learn a lot of that from our time-based media artist colleagues, right? Where, getting a CRT monitor and what it meant to actually have the technology of that period be part of the aesthetic conversation of it. And then with Barbara's work too, being very acutely aware about that screen and fiberglass screen or the emulsion that you're using, and using oil and not acrylic, all of that has a time-based history to it and a cultural history about stability and slippage that I think can be interesting, and it goes against what museums are set up to do, which is to freeze and preserve. So it is that push and pull. That's the push and pull too, about which pieces are allowed to, because they've been lost or disregarded or fallen to the margins, and which ones have these extraordinary resources put at their disposal to preserve, conserve, document, and be part of the historical record.
And I'll just briefly add that I think more and more museums are becoming a little bit more comfortable around the idea of acquiring works by artists that are younger artists that are working today that don't have necessarily the same concerns about durability or the archival. I think of work that's in the MCA's collection by Lotus Kang that has an expiration point where the work is not going to be able to be activated anymore. The question about CRT monitors, there's going to become a time when we can't show things physically on CRT monitors because they're becoming obsolete. The one person that repaired them retired. So it's really just a grudge match between museums to get like the 5 CRTs that still exist in the world. So I think with time, museums will adjust to what artists are doing. That's what we've always had to do.
But, as an artist, just think back to Rauschenberg using trash and, oil paint that was meant to be on walls. And it seems like there's more of obsession about keeping things forever. And maybe we don't need to, It's something to think about. Why are we doing this? Do we, to keep it in the same state that it was made in is not necessarily a great, there's not a need for it. There's more art coming. Don't we keep it just going, I think.
But I will say that curation equals conservation, and acquisition makes conservation happen. And those things have, and everyone has choices in which works that they're pulling. Barbara T. Smith, you made happen again in a moment when that work did not exist as artwork. It existed as archival work, right? So to put it back into public display, or in this collection that we see here today, the choice is to bring work into the foreground that was hovering, let's say, in the background, or even with the works that you said you have 30 of those pieces. I can't wait to see them come back out, right? So that exhibitions make those kinds of cascading effects happen.
Yeah.
Okay, with 5 minutes to spare. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you,
Barbara.
Gloria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bamfa.
Thank you, Jamillah. That was amazing.
Thank you. And now there's a tour with Margot Norton, my esteemed colleague, of Making Their Mark. Thank you.